All right, so today we're going to dive deep into German social law, specifically, how it works with the German Constitution, the Grundgesetz.
Yeah.
And we've got some interesting research here, and I think some listeners might be surprised to learn that some social benefits have actually been ruled unconstitutional.
Yeah, that's right. I think it really comes down to this kind of fascinating tension. How do you create this robust social safety net without kind of stepping on individual rights? Germany takes both very seriously, and that's where some of these really interesting conflicts can come up.
That's like walking a tightrope,
Mhm.
right? And today we're going to explore exactly how they manage that balancing act, looking at some specific cases. But before we get into those specifics, I think it'd be good to get a quick overview of just the structure of the system itself. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So Germany's social law system, it's all laid out in the Sozialgesetzbuch. It's also called SGB, and you can kind of think of this as a giant instruction manual for their social security system. It's divided into 12 books that cover everything from pensions to healthcare to benefits for people who are looking for work.
12 books. Okay, that's a lot. So where do we even begin with that?
Well, let's focus on the one that's been at the heart of some major legal showdowns. So that would be SGB2, which deals with basic needs for people who are looking for work. This is where things get really interesting because it's all about making sure that people who are receiving support can live with dignity, which is where the Constitution comes in.
Okay, so it sounds like SGB2 is really where we see this tension between supporting people and also protecting individual rights.
Yeah, exactly. It all kind of comes to a head in SGB2.
So tell me a little more about that.
Well, so back in 2019, the German Constitutional Court, which is like the highest court in the country, they ruled that some of the penalties within SGB 608 were actually too harsh. So these penalties were originally designed to encourage people to look for jobs. But the court actually said that they could end up pushing people into really desperate poverty, and that this actually violated Article 1 of the Grundgesetz, which is the right to human dignity.
So it's interesting that even when someone is receiving support, the government can't just impose any kind of penalty, right? They have to respect those basic human rights.
Exactly. And it actually goes even deeper than that. The court also found that the way that they calculated benefit levels under SGB II wasn't transparent enough, and it wasn't really fair. They argued that the support that was being provided, it might not actually be enough to meet people's needs. So this was seen as another potential violation of that right to a dignified existence.
Like they're saying, hey, you can't just throw some breadcrumbs at people and call it social support. It has to be enough to really allow people to live with dignity.
That's exactly right. And this case really highlights how those fundamental rights that are enshrined in the Grundgesetz, they act as a safeguard against any potential overreach by the government. Even when it comes to social programs, these rights are still protected.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So just to kind of recap what we've talked about so far, we have the SGB, this massive set of social laws that's aiming to provide a safety net for people. But then we also have the Grundgesetz, and that makes sure that those laws don't overstep and take away people's individual rights.
Oh, exactly. You got it.
And I think you mentioned this tension isn't just limited to SGB2, right?
Yeah, that's right. It pops up in a lot of different areas. One really fascinating case involved long-term care insurance. The court actually ruled that it was unconstitutional to make parents and childless individuals pay the same rate for this insurance.
Wait a minute. Why is that a problem? Doesn't everyone need long-term care at some point?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. The court recognized that raising children actually puts a unique burden on parents. And they actually argued that raising children is such a major contribution to society that parents deserve to get a little bit of financial relief in other areas since they're already doing so much.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty unique way of looking at it. Like they're saying raising kids is its own form of social contribution.
Exactly. And this really shows us that German social law isn't just about meeting basic needs. It's also about reflecting some of the deeper values of German society. And in this case, they're saying, we really value families and the work that parents do.
Okay, so it's not just about the money. It's about these, deeper values.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious, how did this whole system come to be? Was it always this comprehensive?
Well, to understand that, we have to go back in time a little bit. The roots of the German welfare state, they actually go all the way back to the 19th century with a guy named Otto von Bismarck.
Of course, Bismarck. Always up to something, right?
Yeah, he's kind of a big deal. But Bismarck, back in the 1880s, he's the one who introduced health insurance, accident insurance, and pension insurance in Germany. And this was revolutionary at the time. Those laws, they're called the Bismarckian social laws, and they really laid the foundation for everything that came after.
So it's like he planted the seed for this huge Social Security tree that we see today.
Exactly. And that tree, it really started growing after World War II. When Germany was drafting its new constitution in 1949, the Grundgesetz, they actually enshrined the principle of a social state right into the constitution itself. So it became a core value of German society.
Okay, so it's not just about the laws. It's actually like baked into the DNA of their legal system.
Right.
But you mentioned earlier that the system is, constantly evolving, right? It's not just this static thing.
Yeah, it's definitely not static. The world today is so different from what it was back in Bismarck's time, even in the post-war era. And Germany is constantly facing new challenges.
Yeah.
Demographic shifts, globalization. The social law system has to keep up with these changes.
It's like trying to hit a moving target. How do they make sure that it actually stays relevant and it actually works with all of these changes happening?
So there are a few things that they do. First off, Germany has this very rigorous legislative process. Before they pass any new social law, it's really scrutinized. They want to make sure that it actually complies with the Grundgesetz, so no cutting corners there. And then you have the courts. The courts are kind of acting as guardians of the Constitution. They have the power to strike down any law that they think is unconstitutional. And even citizens can file complaints if they think their rights are being violated by a law.
So it's like a pretty robust system of checks and balances to make sure that things are working the way they should.
Exactly. It shows how seriously Germany takes both social welfare and individual freedoms.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about how social laws can sometimes clash with individual rights. But are there any specific parts of the Grundgesetz that are especially relevant to these conflicts?
Yeah, absolutely. Remember those fundamental rights that are listed in the Grundgesetz?
Yeah, the ones in the first 19 articles.
That's right. Well, some of those come up again and again in these legal battles. For example, remember that SGB II sanctions case we talked about? The court specifically cited Article 1, the right to human dignity, when they ruled against those harsh penalties. They said that pushing people into extreme poverty violates that basic principle.
Right, right. So Article 1 is a big one. Are there any others that come up a lot?
Yeah, so Article 2, the right to freedom of personal development, is another big one. It basically means you have the right to make your own choices about your life. But when social laws place conditions on receiving benefits, that can sometimes limit people's choices.
Oh, so this is where that whole walking a tightrope thing comes in again, right? They have to help people without being too controlling.
Exactly. And then we have Article 3, which is the right to equality before the law. This one's really important to make sure that social laws aren't discriminating against anyone. They have to apply fairly to everyone.
Okay, so Article 1 is about dignity, Article 2 is about freedom of choice, and Article 3 is about equality. It sounds like they're trying to cover all the bases there.
Yeah, they're really trying to be comprehensive. And there are other relevant articles too, like Article 14, for example, which protects property rights. Now, this might seem a little bit out of place in a conversation about social law, but it actually plays a key role.
Wait, property rights and social welfare, how are those two connected?
Well, think about how they pay for these social programs. They use taxes, right? And in a way, taxes are kind of a limitation on property rights because the government is taking a portion of your income or your assets to pay for these programs.
Oh, I see what you mean. So it's about finding that balance again, the right to your own property versus the collective good of taking care of people.
That's exactly it. And the German legal system is designed to figure out where that balance lies. The Grundgesetz acts as a safeguard, and the courts are there to make sure everything stays fair.
This is all so interesting. I'm really starting to get a sense of how this whole system works. And it's really impressive how much thought they've put into it.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating system.
But I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there's so much more to talk about, right?
Oh, absolutely. We've just scratched the surface here. There are so many more interesting cases and nuances and big questions that we could explore. And that's exactly what we're going to do as we continue our deep dive. You know, one area where this whole balancing act gets kind of tricky is with data privacy. Think about it. Like when you apply for social benefits, you have to share so much personal information. And Germany, as you probably know, is really serious about data protection.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They have a reputation for having those really strict privacy laws.
Yeah.
But how does that actually work when we're talking about social programs?
Well, they have a whole book in Sozialgesetzbuch book that's dedicated to it. So that would be SGBX. And it basically lays out all these strict rules about how they can handle all that social data. But even with even with these safeguards in place, you can still have conflicts. Like, for example, there's been a lot of debate lately about using algorithms to try to detect fraud in these social welfare programs.
Wait, algorithms. So you mean like computer programs making decisions about people's benefits? How does that even work?
Yeah, so the idea is that these algorithms can analyze these massive data sets, and they're basically looking for any kind of patterns that might point to fraudulent activity. So it could be things like multiple applications that have really similar information, or maybe there are inconsistencies in someone's reported income. And the goal is to make the whole system more efficient and to prevent people from taking advantage of it.
Yeah, I can see how that might save money, but it also sounds like it could be really intrusive. Like, what if the algorithm makes a mistake? What if they flag someone as a potential fraudster and they're actually innocent?
Yeah, and that's exactly what critics are worried about. They're saying that these systems could be biased, they could be inaccurate, they might be overly intrusive, and so it could lead to false accusations, and that could really erode people's trust in the whole social welfare system.
So it's another one of those tightrope walks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Trying to be efficient, but also trying to protect individual rights. Where do the courts stand on all of this?
Yeah, the courts are really struggling with these issues right now. They're trying to weigh this need to prevent fraud against the potential harm to people's privacy and their right to due process. It's a really complicated legal and ethical issue.
It's pretty fascinating how these new technologies are creating all these brand new challenges for social law, right? It's not just about figuring out how to interpret the laws that we already have. It's about figuring out how these laws apply in a world that's constantly changing.
Exactly, yeah. And I think all of this really just highlights how social law is about so much more than just rules and regulations, right?
Yeah.
It's really about fundamental values, human rights, and what kind of society we want to live in.
Okay, you've definitely convinced me. Social law is way more interesting than I thought it was. But with all of these potential conflicts and challenges, are there ever times when the German system just gets it wrong? Like, have there been any social laws that have really clearly crossed the line and violated people's rights?
There have been some cases where the courts had to step in and say, nope, this is going too far. One example that comes to mind is this concept of Wohnsitzauflage, which basically means residence requirement.
Residence requirement. So, like, you have to live in a certain place to get benefits.
Right, exactly. So sometimes the government can require people who are getting unemployment benefits to live in a specific area, and it's usually an area where there are a lot of job opportunities. The idea is that it'll make it easier for people to find work.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But it also sounds a little restrictive, right? Does that ever conflict with the whole idea of freedom of movement?
It absolutely does. Article 11 of the Grundgesetz guarantees everyone the freedom of movement. And so the courts have really had to think carefully about this right and how it balances with the government's interest in getting people back to work.
Yeah, so who usually wins in these situations? Do the courts typically side with the government or the individual?
Well, it's not always that straightforward. The courts have actually generally upheld this idea of residence requirements, but they have set really strict limits on how they can be used. Like, for example, the area where someone has to live has to have real job opportunities that match their skills.
Mm-hmm.
And the restriction can't be forever. There's usually a time limit, and then the person can move wherever they want.
Oh, so it's kind of like a temporary nudge to encourage people to find work, but it's not supposed to be a permanent restriction on their freedom.
Right. And the courts have also said that there need to be exceptions made for things like family reunification or medical needs, and they're acknowledging that sometimes these other fundamental rights might be more important than the goal of promoting employment.
And that's pretty cool. It's really impressive how much thought they put into these decisions, right? It's not just about blindly applying the law. It's about looking at the individual person and trying to be fair.
Absolutely. And this focus on individual rights goes beyond just freedom of movement. Another really important right that comes up a lot in these cases is the right to equality, which is found in Article 3 of the Grundgesetz.
Okay, equality. But aren't social programs already designed to address inequality? They're supposed to help people who are struggling, right?
You're right, that is the goal. It's all about trying to level the playing field. But sometimes, even when the intentions are good, these programs can accidentally create or perpetuate inequalities. And one area where this has been a real problem is in how they treat non-citizens, especially refugees and asylum seekers.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a really sensitive area. What kind of problems have come up?
Well, there have been cases where refugees and asylum seekers have been denied certain benefits, or maybe they're given less support than German citizens, even when their needs are basically the same. And this raises some serious concerns about discrimination and whether everyone's really being treated equally under the law, which they should be.
Yeah, Article 3 is pretty clear. It says that everyone is equal before the law. So shouldn't denying benefits based on citizenship be a clear violation of that?
You'd think so, right? And in a lot of cases, the courts have actually stepped in to make sure that everyone in Germany is treated equally, regardless of their citizenship. But it's not always so simple.
What do you mean? What else makes this so complicated?
Well, sometimes there are actually legitimate reasons to treat certain groups differently. Like some social benefits are specifically meant to be a reward for people who have contributed to the social security system over time. And so refugees and asylum seekers, they may have only recently arrived, so they haven't had the chance to make those contributions yet.
So it's not always about being discriminatory. It's about understanding how the system works.
Right. And then you also have all these political and societal debates about how much support should be given to non-citizens, especially when the resources are limited. So it becomes this balancing act, trying to help people in need while also making sure the system can stay afloat.
That's a lot to juggle. So how do the courts actually handle these kinds of cases? How do they know when a law is actually discriminatory and when it's okay to treat people differently?
Well, they basically look for a reason why it makes sense to treat people differently. So if a benefit is meant to reward people for contributing to the system, then it might be reasonable to exclude people who haven't contributed yet. But the courts are really careful to make sure that any distinctions are necessary and not just some kind of arbitrary discrimination. They really want to make sure that social law is about supporting everyone's basic needs and ensuring everyone can live with dignity no matter who they are or where they come from.
That makes sense. It sounds like the courts are playing a really important role in protecting the rights of people who might not be able to protect themselves.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a good reminder that the right to equality is not just some abstract idea. It has a huge impact on how people are treated in their everyday lives.
Wow, this is really eye-opening. I never realized how much depth there was to all of this. It's not just about giving people money. It's about trying to create a fair society for everyone.
That's what's so cool about social law. It really touches on so many different parts of life, and it reflects our values as a society.
I am hooked. Can't wait to see what other interesting stuff we uncover as we keep going with our deep dive. So we've talked a lot about how German social law tries to balance providing support with protecting individual rights. But I'm kind of curious, what's next? Like, what are the big challenges that are coming up that could really change things in this area of law?
Well, that's a really great question, and it's one that legal experts in Germany are thinking about a lot right now. I think one of the biggest challenges facing Germany, and actually a lot of developed countries, is this whole issue of demographic change. So Germany's population is getting older, which means you have fewer people working and paying into the system, and more people retiring and needing benefits.
Oh yeah, the pension problem. I've heard about this. It sounds like it could put a huge strain on the Social Security system.
Right, exactly. And it's forcing Germany to really rethink how it funds and structures these social programs. They're looking at things like maybe raising the retirement age, encouraging more immigration to boost the workforce, and coming up with creative ways to make the system more sustainable over the long term.
Yeah, those are some tough decisions. I bet it's going to take a lot of careful planning to find solutions that work for everyone.
Oh, for sure. And this whole demographic shift is happening at the same time as another big trend. The nature of work itself is changing. So you've got globalization, automation, the gig economy. All of this is disrupting traditional employment, and it's making it a lot harder for people to find stable, good-paying jobs.
It's not just about older people needing support anymore. It's also about younger people coming into a totally different job market than their parents did.
Yeah.
How does social law adapt to something like that?
That is the question, right? It creates a whole new set of challenges. Like, how do you create a safety net for people who are constantly going from one gig to the next or who are working in these kind of unstable conditions? How do you make sure everyone have health care and retirement savings when this idea of having a career with one company for your whole life is basically disappearing?
It's like they need to come up with a whole new playbook, right?
Yeah.
Are there any other big trends out there that could shake things up?
Yeah. Well, one area that's causing a lot of debate is how social law intersects with climate change.
Climate change. Now, that's not something I would have expected to hear in a conversation about social law. I mean, how are those two even connected?
Well, think about the impacts of climate change, right? Like, they're going to hit the most vulnerable people the hardest. People who are already struggling with things like poverty or unemployment or health problems, they're the ones who are least prepared to deal with things like extreme weather or rising sea levels or disruptions to the food supply.
Like climate change is going to make these existing inequalities even worse.
Exactly. And it's making legal experts think about how social law can be used to lessen those impacts, right? Like, how can they make sure everyone has the resources they need to adapt to a changing climate? It's about incorporating a sense of, like, environmental justice into social support.
So it's not just about traditional social programs anymore. It's about realizing that social problems and environmental problems are kind of all connected, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's a much more holistic way of thinking about things.
Wow, this is blowing my mind a little bit. It's amazing to think about how these big global trends are actually reshaping something as specific as German social law.
It really shows you that everything is connected, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it really highlights how, like, law isn't this fixed thing. It's always changing to keep up with the world.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we've covered a lot today. We've gone over the history of German social law. We've looked at how social programs can sometimes clash with individual rights. And we've even touched on some of the challenges that are coming up in the future.
It's been a really great conversation. I hope our listeners have a better understanding of how this complex system actually works in practice and how it tries to find that balance between supporting people and respecting individual rights.
I think so too. And maybe the most important thing is that we've seen how this balance is constantly being tested and questioned and adjusted to keep up with new challenges and new ideas. It shows us that the law is really a leading thing, and it reflects who we are and the kind of society we want to live in.
Yeah, I love that. It really captures it perfectly.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to chew on. So as technology keeps advancing, demographics shift, and the world keeps changing, how will Germany, and actually how will all of us, figure out how to balance social responsibility with individual freedom? What will social law look like in the future, and how will it shape the world around us? These are some big questions, and I don't think there are any easy answers, but they're definitely worth thinking about. So until next time, deep divers, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world around us. We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.